Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening to the Keynote podcast on speaking engagement. I'm your host, Ryan Catherwood. On the show this week, my special guest is Christine Cruzvergara. Christine just wrapped up a tenure at Handshake as the Chief Education Strategy Officer. I first met Christine many years ago, almost 10 years ago, when we were both working as the career services leaders at Virginia State Universities. From the very minute I met Christine, I could tell that she was someone who was really dialed in to the space, had a ton of thoughts and insights about where the field was headed. And it was great to watch Christine's career grow and blossom as she took on other leadership roles in career services, published lots of articles on LinkedIn and elsewhere, and then, of course, her role at Handshake. Hope you enjoy this conversation with Christine Cruzvergara. I really enjoyed reconnecting with her. It had been since she worked at George Mason University back more than 10 years ago that we had a chance to chat. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening and making the Keynote part of your routine. Hope you enjoy the rest of the content we produce each week on speaking engagement through Substack. All right, thanks so much for listening. Now my interview with Christine Cruzvergara. Christine Cruzvergara, thank you so much for being on the Keynote this week. It is so good to have you.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
We had the chance to meet many years ago now, back when you were leading the the career services unit at George Mason University. We got
Mhm.
together as part of a cohort of folks who assembled leading career services across Virginia institutions. But since then, you've had an adventure out on the West Coast and others in New England at Wellesley. Maybe for those who haven't met you yet, if you just share a little bit about your career path in the education space.
Yeah, definitely. So I spent about a decade, a little over a decade of my career in higher education, mostly up and down the East Coast. As you said, I've worked in the DC region, mostly worked at all of the Georges, GW, Georgetown, and George Mason. And then I left to go up to the Boston area to work at Wellesley as the associate provost for career education. And most recently moved out to San Francisco. And I've actually been here now for almost a decade, 7.5 years, working at Handshake as the Chief Education Strategy Officer.
Yeah, I mean, I recall back when you announced that big change that you were leaving for the West Coast and for Handshake. It's hard to believe that, that many years have gone by, but you've had several senior career services roles. You just mentioned
Yeah.
them. And of course, your role at Handshake. What have you enjoyed the most about working on campus, but then also, what have you loved about this change to Handshake into the corporate culture?
Yeah, I think, working on campus, of course, the thing that we all probably enjoy the most is working directly with students. Every year, you have a fresh batch of students coming in, you have fresh energy, you have new ideas, you have a new generation that you're helping to educate and you're helping to send off into the world. And there's nothing sort of more rewarding than being able to do that. I think, in addition to that, though, institutions are very large entities that are complex and have a lot of different layers. And I personally really enjoyed understanding the unique culture of the different types of institutions that I worked at. I mean, Georgetown to George Mason to Wellesley, like, could not be
All
more
very
different.
different.
Extremely
Yeah.
different. And I think understanding that culture and learning how to navigate the politics was actually something that I really enjoyed tackling.
So was there someone in your role at Handshake prior to you, Christine, or was this role new to Handshake?
My role itself was new, so it did not exist in the form that I had it at Handshake. And what I would say was really unique about the way that Jonathan Stahl, who's our president at Handshake, decided to craft this particular role was that he actually did not want it to be just a chief evangelist. He didn't want me to have an evangelist role because he believed that it was critical for me to actually have accountability and responsibility in the business and in the operations. And without that, I actually would lack influence. So whatever I was saying sort of out on the road or publicly would not carry the weight or the substance in actually designing the strategy internally at the company. So the way that the role was designed, and I'm really grateful to him for that, I ran the education side of the business. So the sales team, the success team, the ops team, um, parts of product and engineering also sat at my leadership team table. So in some ways, some folks would look at my position and they would describe it as like almost a GM or general manager type position because of all the different business functions that rolled up into it. And that allowed me to have a seat at the table, both at the executive level, but across the company, to be able to have real say in the strategy and in the direction that we were taking, both the product, the roadmap, the company, in addition to what most people in our field probably saw of me, from an external lens. So
Yeah.
it was a real joy and a huge learning curve for me, to be able to do that, to step into that. I had obviously never worked with engineering or product or managed a sales team or a success team. These were all new things to me when I made the leap. Um, and for me, I think it was a few things that sort of propelled my move over to Handshake. One, it was extremely personal. I had already advanced quite a bit within higher education at a fairly young age, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to necessarily stay in higher education or in that role for the next 20, 30 years. I was someone who often was looking for a new challenge. And so I wanted to create optionality for myself. And a dear friend and mentor suggested that by taking a role similar to this, it would just simply open up options for me. And so the idea of optionality was extremely attractive to me.
Yeah.
I think the second piece is the way I've always looked at all of our work is that no one entity can solve some of the problems that we are trying to solve. It takes players from multiple different parts of the landscape to be able to bring their strengths to that. And this was a part of the landscape that I had not been exposed to as much. I didn't know as much about, and I wanted to be able to dive in and learn more about how tech worked and how tech could really support the scaling of some of the efforts across institutions, and this gave me an inside view to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I can totally see why you moved across the country for this role at Handshake. Very challenging, and you had the chance to provide yourself future open doors of all sorts by taking the role. So you got there, and you're at 1,500 feet, and you're exposed to the challenges that higher ed is facing, but from a very different angle. And the ones you're looking at, I think, are probably many, but
Mhm.
technology, of course, would be one. Technology adoption, the way in which career services units, in particular, but maybe not exclusively, were adopting Handshake and creating it. As an adopter of Handshake myself, we could talk a little bit more about that, but it was had a multi-pronged set of challenges to successful adoption, reaching
Mhm.
students and using the various products within the platform, and some sort of mandate system right around the first destination survey. And you guys were there, trying to tackle so many of these challenges. But when you reflect back on the ones that were really standing out to you.
That's interesting. I think what's challenging about the question for me personally is even when I was on just one campus, I never looked at my work as purely isolated to just the campus I was on. I mean, Ryan, you and I go way, way back. And so, as you remember, my first article actually about sort of future trends in career services came out in 2014. And so, I think I've always been really
Yeah.
fascinated with what are the patterns and trends that are happening across the entire field or across the entire sort of ecosystem for career education or for workforce. And I think what being at Handshake allowed me to do was to, as you said, really have that bird's eye view, look across those multiple institutions. In a way that was even broader than what I was already sort of doing when I was at the individual institution. I think what gave me a really interesting perspective was actually hearing from so many different entities. So before, when you're at an institution, and especially if you work in career education, most of your network are other career services professionals. And in your line of work, Ryan, maybe it's also some alumni folks or some advancement folks or other people that work within institutions. Being at Handshake, I was able to take in the perspective of millions of employers, large, small, regional, mom and pop shops. I was able to bring in the perspective of government, state, local, federal, bring in other associations like Lumina, like Strata, like Gallup, so on and so forth. And I think having all of that perspective, it allows us to actually look at the work that we do a little bit differently. And so, for example, um, Handshake's sort of always been at the edge of pushing the boundaries of where the workforce and recruiting is sort of changing and how that's
Mm.
looking. And I think we were able to look perhaps a year or two ahead around making sure, for example, that students had access to the largest amount of opportunity possible, while also still giving schools an opportunity to curate things that were more interesting to their specific student population. Or right now, we're actually in the midst of rolling out some natural language reporting that's going to allow institutions to be able to tell a story and a narrative for their institution in a way that was just simply harder before that technology was created or accessible and scaled to 1,600 plus institutions. So I think for me, it's always been a little bit more about like the patterns and trends across the entire marketplace.
Makes sense. And that's what you're trying to thread together the needs of the marketplace, individual employers, college age young folks, campus administrators, campus leaders attempting to secure return on investment for the
Yeah.
work that they're doing in the career space. But I recall pretty vividly back when I read a piece from you and Farouk Day, where I forget, were you still at George Mason when you wrote that, or was that back
We've written
when you were
two.
at Handshake? Do you recall?
Yeah, we've written
You've
two.
written
The one
two. The one
without
particular that
Mason.
The one I remember particularly was your focus on why the academy academic affairs was really the key, because
Mm.
on a campus, that's how you make career education equitable, when every faculty member feels as though in some way, shape, or form it should be layered across the curriculum, right, to make it so that students of all shapes and sizes, no matter what background they have, whether they're first gen or not, whether their parents are, have a great sense of networking, or they're in the business major, so there's more talk of networking and career development, that was a really helpful construct for me personally. But talk a little bit about, how you've thought about change in career services, and it's been a thread that ties your background, pre-Handshake, I realize, but talk a little bit about how you've sort of seen that, and what, if anything's maybe changed, and what should we be thinking about now as far as an old model that should be, reversed.
Yeah, there are a few things that Farouk and I talked about as early as 2014, all the way kind of through now. And I think you're starting to see some of those changes. So, one was elevation of career services so that it wasn't a peripheral office, but rather one that had a seat at the table. And with that, we were proponents of elevating or changing the title and changing the reporting line in particular. I think we've started to see that across more and more institutions. I think when Farouk and I first talked about some of these changes, one of the major changes that needed to be a catalyst for integration into the academy, into curriculum, was elevation of career services. And when we first talked about this was 2014 when we first wrote about it, and we said we need to elevate the titles, we need to elevate the reporting line for career services leaders so that they have a real seat at the table. It's now 2026, and we're just starting to see more and more institutions take advantage of this. So you are seeing more positions in career services be AVP, um, vice provost. They're starting to report directly into the provost or into the vice president for alumni and advancement, or VP for enrollment management, or even in some cases, like myself, when I was at Wellesley, reporting directly to the president and sitting on that cabinet. And you're starting to see those, but it's still not the norm. across every institution. But the ones that are doing that are really starting to see great progress at their institutions. The longest standing person is Andy Chan. He's been at Wake Forest for a long time. He's been the vice president for a long time. He reported to President Hatch for a long time. And what he was able to do at that institution has been truly remarkable. And you look at somebody more recently, let's say Joe Catrino at Dartmouth, who recently has started his sort of transition. He is AVP. He reports into, I believe, the provost, but meets with the president on a monthly basis. He has a seat at the table. The entire capital campaign is very much taking into consideration the needs of internship funds as well as the career services funds. And so when you see that, you start to see that type of cultural integration that Farouk and I were talking about. I still am a big believer in the integration into the curriculum, but I recognize that that looks different at every institution. You're not going to get every faculty member to necessarily buy into how career services or career education needs to work within their specific course. But it is possible to think about how do you add career elements or an elective that is part of the program so that it's not a question of whether or not a student comes into your office. It's just a matter of when they're taking that particular course so that they get some guidance, any guidance at all within their 4 years. And that doesn't require actually faculty buy-in. That requires deans to look at the overall curriculum and figure out how you might be able to insert even one, if not two of these classes over the course of a 4-year span. It could be part of general education as it doesn't have to be part of the academic program either.
I think it's, as you said, all about creating some level of certainty that every student gets some baseline interactions with professionals in this space during their campus journey, and providing more in-depth opportunities to engage content and experiences as students move through their college experience. But
Mhm.
one of the things that's happening now, I would say, is the lots of schools have attempting to elevate these issues, in particularly, applied learning opportunities while students are in college, right?
Mhm.
So yes, there's an education component, but then applied so that students have resume caliber experiences on their resumes by the time they graduate and are even more competitive. And I think schools bring this to the top level of the institution, and sometimes it can end up in the strategic plan for the
Mhm.
school. We're going to be focused
Yep.
on applied learning opportunities. And so I think you're right. It definitely is reaching the highest level of importance. But one of the things this ends up, you know, realizing across the institution is that it's actually really hard to do that. And to be successful, it really can't sit in one office alone. Has to
Mm.
be everybody's responsibility, to help through these career challenges. So talk about, what does this look like when an institution maybe actually gets this right?
I think one of the things that's super important here is that while everybody has a hand to play in career education, you do still need a leader. You need a leading career services person, and you do still need an office that serves as the central place for where the strategy stems from. Otherwise, you've got a mess. You've got a very chaotic mess on your hands at institutions. So, the number one thing that a leader of any institution would probably need to do first is make sure you're hiring the right person. These days, a career services leader is not someone who's just operational. It is also not someone who is purely strategic. You need someone who is a strategist that also knows how to execute operationally at a very rigorous pace and knows how to lead change, because they need to hire the right people within their office who are going to be the executors and the operational agents across campus, because those are the individuals that you need to have collaborating with the faculty that are already champions with you, with the student affairs folks, with the alumni folks, with the advancement folks, with the enrollment management folks. You kind of have to have those tentacles out onto campus so that all of this is coordinated. You have a compelling vision, you have a consistent message or narrative, and all of the various programs or entities or partnerships are actually all working together towards one direction rather than everybody trying to do a little bit of everything. So I think the institutions that get this right are the institutions that have hired the right type of leader to actually lead this forward. That is probably first and most critical to ensuring that this works. The second is making sure that that leader actually has the seat at the table, like I've mentioned before, so that they have the um, power and influence to actually help bring some of these initiatives together and bring people along. And of course, they have to be able to lead change and change mindset in order to do that.
The connection between a career services unit at an institution and the alumni office is
Mhm.
often one that is underused, underdeveloped, and I think that there are so many opportunities at any institution to enhance the career network. Why do you think there's so much struggle in this area as schools work to activate an alumni population and engage them as volunteers across their, whether it's creating micro internships or mentoring more broadly, or participating in career related experiences?
Mhm.
The schools that struggle here, where are the gaps? And maybe there, you've noticed schools that are doing what you think of as modern day career services particularly well.
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I mean, the most basic is often there's some type of relationship gap between the Career Center and the Alumni Office. Whether that's
Right.
the leaders aren't talking or the offices aren't collaborating or people are being territorial about their spaces, but there's some type of relationship gap. And sometimes that's structural, and sometimes that's literally like the people in the roles are making that difficult. So often that's like the first barrier or the first hurdle that you have to be able to get over is that piece of it. I think the second sometimes is um, alumni offices, depending on the institution, some are more focused on the alumni that are able to engage and perhaps also give at a higher rate. And so they're not as focused on the young alumni who often might not have as much to offer other than their experience or their time and attention. And so that varies significantly depending on institutions I've been at. And I would imagine, Ryan, what you have seen across the field as well. So I think the engagement of young alumni in particular is really core and very key, especially because students tend to say that they would like to get advice primarily from people who are within 5 years out of graduation. But if you look at a lot of alumni offices or alumni offices that might be housed within advancement, sometimes the focus is on the slightly older alumni that have been out a little bit farther. And so I think sometimes there's a mismatch on some of that. And then I think the other piece is there's lack of sharing of information. So career centers are focused on sometimes engaging alum or recruiters or employers who happen to be alumni and they have it in their database or their system. The alumni office has information and maybe they are engaging with young alumni, but they have it in their system and the right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. And they're not sharing. They haven't
Happens a
figured
lot.
Yes, they haven't figured out a system for actually sharing that information. And I think that's really key. I think in the ideal world, I think if you were to look at the student population of any institution, it would be fantastic if you could provide every active student with at least 3 alumni in their industry or their field of interest to talk to. That would be ideal. And I guarantee for any given institution, that's still only a fraction of your alumni base, of your full alumni base. So if you made that a
Yeah.
target or a goal, what you're essentially doing is actually a concept that I pushed quite heavily when I was at Wellesley, which is the idea of helping to build a personal board of advisors for every student. You don't just have one mentor in your career. Ryan, I'm sure you go to multiple people when you think about advice or guidance that you might need. Same thing goes for our students. They need more than just one person. They need a board. And if as an institution, we can provide at least 3 people per student, That is not only a way to activate your alumni base, which down the road could lead to giving, but it also allows us to do a better job of making those connections for students. And in this particular day and age where we are in this sort of AI ecosystem, I believe that that in real life connection is more important than ever. And it's something that is very
Yeah.
unique to what an institution can provide.
Totally. I remember vividly towards the end of my tenure at Longwood University, I was creating what I called, roadmaps for individual students where I would actually reach out to three alumni and say, "Hey, would you chat with this person?" And then turn to the student and say, "Here's this document that says who these students are, excuse me, who these alums are, what relevance they have to you, something you might like
Mhm.
to ask them about." And it didn't scale very well, you know. But, it was definitely, the types of connections that I think make that most impact on the lives of students as they're, trying to think about their own personal board like you've described. What do you think is a common mistake that you see institutions making when they try to transform career services?
Oh my gosh, Ryan, you and I could have an entire hour-long podcast on just this question alone.
I think so. It's just a question of, like, what type of mistake rather than which
Yeah,
one's the
there's so
biggest,
many.
yeah.
There's so many. Let me if you don't mind, I'll rattle off a few and feel free to
Okay,
follow up
alright.
with any particular one that's interesting to you.
We can pick
Um,
one.
I think a very common mistake is, the institution doesn't know how to lead change, or you don't have the right leaders that know how to lead change and to engage people and their emotions and their feelings and their motivations in that change. I think a lot of times some institutions take too long for the transformation. They're trying to do it over the course of 3 years, when the reality is often you can do some of this within the first 6 months to really show momentum, and then it's a matter of sustaining and building on that. While the next one's gonna sound really basic, but I know a lot of institutions that don't actually talk to students when they're trying to do this
How do you
transformation. I
feel about that? Because I feel like one of the things I wanted was actually popping up in my head as a potential mistake is spending too much time talking in one-on-one type appointments with students.
Mm,
How do you, because I feel like there's this problem of scale,
mhm.
reaching as many students you can if you are
Yep.
focused on one-on-one appointments. Like, how did you think about that as the leader of, career units, but then more broadly from your vantage point at
Yeah.
Handshake?
Well, I think I'm thinking about it from a change perspective and not from an appointment
Okay.
perspective. So I think there are too often institutions that try and change what career education is going to look like, and they don't do any focus groups with students. They don't survey students. They don't talk to students. They're not asking students, why are you here? What are you looking for? What do you want to get out of your education? What feels most stressful or anxious to you? How can we best support you? Those types of questions. I think the appointment and the one on one piece is a separate operational challenge that I would agree with you. Too often, too many centers have anchored all of their service time on one, which doesn't allow them to scale, because the reality is no office is ever going to be big enough or have enough people, FTE, to be able to actually have one on ones with their entire student population, with the exception of probably a few liberal arts institutions that have such a large team and such a small student population that they might be able to. So
Might be able to.
I think
Yeah.
what we're talking about are actually kind of like two separate issues,
Yeah.
two different
Yeah.
things. But for me, I was referring to more like, are you getting the perspective of the people you are trying to serve as you change or transform what your office, service, division looks like?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to ask about as we move forward. To what degree can we use artificial intelligence as the source of truth when we're providing students with feedback, or
Mhm.
we're talking about the one-to-one coaching? When does AI become the more trusted one-to-one coach, and how do you leverage career services staff time to be doing other really important things? We described the idea of making connections with people, warm handshakes with alumni for students. But I think all of this is because students and families increasingly think of higher ed as, an economic ROI lens, and I think it's something to push back on. But then again, it really is a reality that schools need to embrace. And, AI is at the center of all this. But talk to me a little bit how you think about the reality of today's moment that schools really need to think about and embrace?
Yeah, I think the ROI question is a real one. College is extremely expensive. Universities are expensive, and students are taking out massive amounts of loans. The majority of students are taking out massive amounts of loans to be able to go to school. And parents and families want to see some type of return when they graduate. They want them to have a good job. The majority of students, you can look at surveys from Gallup, you can look at it from Strata. The majority of students say that they go to school in order to increase or improve their economic mobility post graduation. They are looking at school as a way, as a stepping stone towards getting a better job. Now, I do not believe that it's an either or question. You can become a better person. You can become more self aware. You can become a better citizen. You can contribute to your society better. And you can also be prepared to get a job. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think that false dichotomy has sort of gotten a lot of higher education institutions caught up in this. Well, are we here to educate and to teach folks, or are we here to get them a job? And my answer is, why can't it be both? Why can't we do both of those things? Because that's ultimately how the shape of our audience, of our students, has transformed. And the reality is, we do need to embrace that. And I think often we simply need to just focus on the needs and use the language that actually resonates with our audience, whether that's parents or families or students. And then you can also add in the other piece of education, the other piece of self-reflection, of self-awareness. Like, you can still bring all of that in, but to hook and bring folks along with you, you have to actually meet them where they are. And that requires understanding what their needs are and using that language consistently so that they feel seen and they feel heard and they feel confident that you're going to provide them with those things. And then the other pieces that you add on are extra and also feel really good. And they will realize what a benefit that is post graduation.
So in the career services world, we measure performance by the First Destination survey, which measures employment 6 months before and 6 months after graduation. And it asks, those surveys ask for whether you're full-time job, part-time job, graduate school. It's essentially getting us, a benchmark across the student population at the vast majority of colleges and schools. This is industry practice. How do you think about this particular measurement? What else is needed to really showcase return on investment in this area? Is First Destination, should it still be part of the equation moving forward?
I think it's a helpful metric to use. I don't think it's the only metric to use, but it's certainly at least one that uh, could help to create some sense of a baseline for folks. So I think First Destination at least gives parents, families, institutions a place to start. I think for most institutions, you should be collecting data 5 years out, 10 years out, and honestly, probably 20 years out to really see the lifespan of a particular student, their career, and the impact that your institution had on that career. And I think it's less about what is the career and what's the salary that you're making in the career, but I think it's the learning, the impact, the engagement, almost even a happiness score, if you will, around where you are later in life and how did the education piece play a role in getting you there. Um, and how are you using some of what you learned in the classroom in that way? And so for someone who is, I mean, I'm in the middle of my career, I think often about some of the lessons that I learned in some of the classes and some of the faculty from JMU. And I think about how that has impacted where I am right now in ways that I never could have imagined when I was 21 in Harrisonburg. But if you were to
Yeah.
survey me now, I would be able to give you very rich data around what that looks like. And JMU collectively, if they did this across the entire class of 2005 would probably have a very interesting narrative. And you do this multiple years in a row to be able to really talk about the value of a JMU education, for example. But I recognize that there are challenges with trying to collect that data. Getting data from alumni is never easy. The response rate is extremely low. There are multiple entities out there that have tried to get this, and at best, mostly fall back on salary data that's been scraped. But I do think that that would be the holy grail, is being able to do that.
Yeah, sort of value perception over time. And I guess there's a number of instruments out there when banded together could provide this more longitudinal
Mhm.
picture for us. So whether you're using the alumni attitude study followed by the 5 and 10 year survey, I think
Yeah.
is it the career collaborative? What's the name of the organization? Do you recall? I can edit this
Oh,
out.
yes, the
But
the career leadership, collective, although I was actually
yeah,
thinking about, I was thinking about a different organization that, has even more data on the alumni, and the name escapes me at the
yeah.
moment. But
Well,
yes, to
there's a
your
few other that would
Mhm,
I was gonna say, yeah, there's a few others. I was just gonna say where alumni data is the business model, right? There's stepping blocks, and then there's NZ. I think they might be the same. Live alumni, where you're able to get
mhm,
data that paints the outcomes picture as one that the admissions office can generally use to sort of say that this is going to be good long into the future. But
mhm,
I guess the trick is that, to your earlier point, I didn't really associate my college degree to my professional success till I was in my 30s, and it
mm.
takes a little while, to begin to put those pieces together, what you learned. And I wonder whether or not, as a liberal arts major, a communication studies major, whether or not, if I had had a little more internship, applied learning, that I would have come out of college with a much stronger connection in terms of the return on investment of the degree, and I wouldn't have sort of stumbled upon it later on in my life. But
Can I ask,
um
what made you
please.
in your 30s decide that you could see the connection? What was the catalyst for you that brought you to recognizing what you learned in undergrad?
It was, for me, able to point to a confluence of college learning environments. Whether I was a resident assistant, I was in a fraternity, I worked at our on-campus restaurant. I worked at the speech center where kids could practice their presentations. I was a communication studies major. I really, ultimately, all of the things that I did in college pointed me towards a future career in alumni engagement, or engagement and marketing more broadly. And I had to go through a series of challenging work environments until I got to the point where I was in higher ed, and I could say, okay, I can see how what I learned in college has positioned me to be successful, I think, later on. Let's talk a little bit about the convergence of advancement and alumni engagement. You mentioned something a little bit earlier I wanted to bring back, which is the way in which career services units don't have access to alumni data and vice versa. It's often the case where, say Razor's Edge lives in advancement, and then Handshake lives in the career office, and they do not have shared licenses. That
Mhm,
was something in my merged alumni and career services office I really appreciated, because having access to both, because for one thing, I remember in Handshake, you all identified alumni who were recruiting at the institution.
mhm,
And so I could very clearly point towards this whole crop of amazing alumni who were opting into engaging on behalf of their employer in this other way that advancement would have had no idea about otherwise. But talk a little bit about how you all at Handshake were thinking about the importance of alumni and making those connections more visible to students, and leveraging, from the employer perspective, alumni networks as well. I'm sure you were thinking about that.
Yeah, we thought about it a few different ways. The first was making sure that we gave students direct access, to contact alumni. And so we had a feature within the platform that allowed students to do a search based on their interest areas or based on their institution or based on their major that would allow them to find alumni at their school that they could reach out to, message, and get connected with. So that was one of the first things that we did. That's been in existence for a long time, and it's continued to grow in terms of interest from students. More recently, a few years ago, we rolled out the feed, which actually allowed students and alumni to post short form video like any other feed or advice or guidance. And we actually found a lot of students were finding each other and finding alumni based on the advice that was given. And this actually turned out to be an amazing branding opportunity for employers, where recruiters would also post their own advice. And you can imagine students are like, oh, sweet, I'm like actually hearing from a direct recruiter what they want or how they think about this. And a lot of times that was not only a recruiter, it was also an alum. And so that was another way that people were finding each other organically and being able to develop those relationships. The more recent sort of developments that we've made are also figuring out how do we surface this data and information to the Career Center so that they can do something preemptively or proactively with that data. And so we built out an entire employer relations management sort of module or suite that actually pulls out for schools who are some of the top employers, the top companies, the top industries that your students are most interested in so that you know who the people are that you can go target, you can go reach out to, and you can develop those relationships. And I think at Handshake, one of the most important things that we wanted to help students recognize was that while you have your sphere of your institution and your alumni, you're also fortunate enough to be part of this larger Handshake network and ecosystem. And so if you want to or you need to go beyond just your institution, you can access alumni from some of the other institutions too, because as you and I both know, based on your institution, you might have a large collection of alumni in certain industries, but you might not have many in a very niche industry that some students want to go into. And they might have to go to a neighboring or a partner institution in order to find some of those alums. So those were some of the things that we collectively did to make sure that students had access to those alumni relationships and to try and help make it easier for career centers to tap into that as well.
There's an overlapping segment of people, you described young folks who are early career professionals, who its students want to talk to them and get advice from them and what that's like. From an advancement perspective, we talked about donors. Typically, those skew a bit older because those folks have a bit more disposable income.
Yeah.
But there is usually at most institutions a huge percentage of young alumni who are donors at the annual giving level.
Mm.
And, one opportunity that exists is say, okay, the overlap here, right, is these 200 young alumni donors who let's reach out to them first and
Mm.
see if they're interested in being volunteers, helping out these events. So I think it's like if I was advising a vice president of advancement, I was going to ask you for the same, answer the same question. I would suggest to them that they look for that overlap as a way of bridging the gap between advancement and student affairs or academic affairs in the career perspective,
Yeah.
being proactive around a targeted cohort of young donors who we can safely say are still at the right life stage to make an impact on current and prospective students, but also not losing the philanthropy thread. I'll ask you, what do you think would be good advice for a VP of advancement and working with the career office?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you just suggested is fantastic. Mine is really all about don't gatekeep. Don't gatekeep information, don't gatekeep relationships. I think that's the biggest thing is be willing to open up your platform and your information so that the Career Center is able to your point, look, see before you reach out to a recruiter that might be an alum, you know how the other office has engaged with them so you don't look silly when you reach out. Um, when people think about institutions, they simply think about Longwood. They think about JMU. They think about Berkeley. They're not thinking about the institution from different offices. right? That's how we think about it because we've worked within an institution. But most people are just like, this is the institution. And they get quite annoyed when they feel like the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And so I think if I were advising a VP of advancement, one of the first things would be like, what system or process are you putting into place to actually share information? And even if it's not literally opening up your platform or giving the executive of the Career Center access to log into your platform, there has to be a regular stream of information that is flowing in both directions. And so you've got to figure out what that system is going to be for your institution so that you're both working from the same playbook, essentially. And to your point, if you're going to tap these 200 young alumni, you both know what the value is there, who the people are, and you have the right kind of information that you need from a career services perspective to connect them to the right students, and from a giving perspective to know how you're going to cultivate that.
Yeah. And I think that there's an emphasis on better engagement metrics in the advancement space, and without really strong collaboration between advancement and career services, you're never going to uncover, the alums who are volunteers on behalf of their organizations in one way, shape, or form. And that's just the start of it. I think that there's so much opportunity with this partnership. Let's talk a little bit about the subject of AI once more and
Sure.
revisit that, because I feel like it's on most people's minds these days. It's reshaping entry level work and how students really should be thinking about jobs. What does this mean for how institutions prepare graduates and stay connected to them? We had John Hill from WAP on as our first keynote, someone who you may recall. He had a take about students learning how to be the job rather than find a job,
Mm.
and having a more of a stronger set of skills and experiences during college about being an entrepreneur with the skills that they have. But talk
Mm.
about a little bit about what you think is changing around entry level work.
That's a great question. So there are a few things. AI is certainly transforming entry level work. It's transforming workforce in general. I think if you are a student, one of the first pieces of advice I would give a student is you need to learn AI, whether you like it or not, it's here. And your ability to use it or to discern when you want to use it or when you don't want to use it is something that you're going to have to be able to articulate to an employer. That's what employers want to be able to hear right now. So it's fine if you don't use it for a lot of things or you only use it for specific tasks. But my next question would be as an employer is why? What's your thinking
Yeah.
behind that? What's your judgment call? And for the places where you are using it, how are you using it? And what have you actually built? Show me examples of what you have actually done. Don't just tell me, show me. And so I think becoming more of a builder from a student perspective, it just simply gives you options. It gives you optionality. Because if you know how to use it, you get to decide when you use it, how you use it, why you use it. And being able to explain all of that is really critical to an employer these days. So that's number one.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is recognizing that for some industries, AI has now transformed or changed, redefined what that entry level job looks like. It's not that entry level jobs have been replaced, it's that some of them have drastically changed. So you look at a place like McKinsey, who has actually said very publicly, we are invested in early talent. We are going to continue hiring. We're doubling down on entry talent. That's great. But their expectation is also that entry level workers are going to be using AI to build out more automation, more workflows, or to use their Lily agent to do more. And so, what a typical management consultant would have done in their first year now looks a little bit different because of the technology that they've now incorporated into their workspace. And that's happening in multiple different industries. Obviously, tech, consulting, finance are some of the first places where some of that transformation is happening. But the third thing that I would say, and the final thing that I think is actually really, really critical, is in addition to having AI skills, it is still critical for people to have strong relational intelligence. You must be able to know how to interact with people, how to problem solve, how to conflict manage, how to persuade and convince. Those skills are more important than ever in this sort of AI world because we're all craving that human connection. That is still how things are going to get done. It is still necessary. And so I caution folks to not err too far on the side of purely technical skills and to lose all your people skills, because you truly are going to need a merger of the two to be successful in the future workforce.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. As I was working this past week on learning Claude Cowork,
Yeah.
not just the chat, right, but actually how to create types of daily tasks for it to remember to set them up properly, to be able to explain why I am using AI for these tasks, and when real Ryan is coming through on this one, and to be able to like articulate it's important because the relationships are the important part, the human to human conversations, the ability to sell, as you described. This is where the money will still be as we're able to lean on more task-driven work by AI, and being able to set it up as a skill set, I think, as you're talking about. You care deeply about equity and
Mm.
accessibility. And as AI changes hiring, who is at risk the most of being left behind? And what is the institution's responsibility in this area?
Yeah. Okay. So, first, I would say the responsibility is not just with the institution, but also with the employers. So I think that's key. This is a shared responsibility across multiple entities. I would go so far to say that it's also a shared responsibility across tech platforms in how you think about this. The number one thing that I think I worry about the most is students who don't have access or exposure. So as the technology changes and evolves, which Ryan, you and I both know, it's literally changing by the week. Okay. If you
Yeah,
haven't used Claude in the past 6 weeks, you should use it again because honestly, it'll be completely
it's
different
different.
than what you experienced 6 weeks ago, right? This level of change, this speed of change is unprecedented from anything we have ever experienced in our careers or lifetime. So for
Yeah, or
students who
humanity.
Exactly, exactly. So
Yeah,
for students
yeah.
who don't have access or don't have exposure to the technology itself, I worry that that gap is going to get bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And so what I do think institutions need to provide is at least access to the technology and to the space to be able to learn, to build, to experiment, to figure it out. Essentially, every student should have the opportunity, should they want to take it, to sit down and figure out how to use Claude Code, right?
Yeah.
Or Claude Cowork, and to build something. I fully recognize the entire student population may not want to. There are lots of folks in the current generation that are not interested in doing some of that. That is their personal choice. But as an institution, I do feel like it's our responsibility to at least provide access to it.
Just this, just yesterday, I was looking at an article in the New York Times Magazine. The title of the article is "A University System Went In on AI. Now It's Tearing Itself Apart." California's public universities spent 16.9 million on AI during a financial crisis, and the result has been chaos. We don't have time necessarily to, go through the article, and perhaps at a future date we could pick up our conversation where we left off. But I think that's safe to say that, there is a lot of tricky dynamics associated to ensuring that students have the right type of AI education. And it's obviously needs to be part of it, a rich and robust training and experience using AI, and then of course needing to emphasize those other types of skills and experiences that really create the entire value proposition for students when they study. Just like a couple more questions while I have you, Christine. A bit of a quick fire here at the very end. What is the most overhyped idea in career services right now, in career education?
Oh gosh. I don't know if this is a very popular answer, but I would say the use of buzzwords around different concepts. So like right now, the two biggest concepts I think people are constantly talking about are like career ecosystem or life design. And I don't have an issue with actually either of those two concepts because those concepts have actually existed for years. Like, Ryan, those concepts have existed longer than you and I have been working. We just keep repackaging them with new buzzwords. And then I think people get really attached to the buzzwords. And they're like, oh, I am now a center that focuses on this. And I think sometimes we're like too focused on the buzzword and not focused enough on sort of the substance um, behind it. And really, a lot of those concepts have existed for a long time. A lot of my predecessors and folks that have been in the field of career services have been talking about integration, have been talking about multiple offices being participating in career education, have talked about reflective and proactive questioning of our students, holistically thinking about their values and not just a path straight into a career. Like, these are all parts of both of those theories or models, if you will. And I think sometimes we get a little too caught up in just like the buzzwords, and we lose a little bit of what's behind that. So I think that's important. And the reason I focus on this is because it matters to people within the field. It doesn't matter to people outside of the field. So if you're trying to get buy-in from a president, from a senior leader, from your alumni, from employers, from other entities, a lot of them just want you to simply help students get jobs. Just focus on the work. They don't care about the buzzwords to that piece. And I think sometimes you actually lose people. I've talked to a number of folks who sometimes are like, they just seem so focused on this. I just want to make sure the student has an internship or that they're getting a job, but it seems like they're always talking about these things. And so I think you can lose people who are not in the field with that sometimes.
All right. Well, that seems like a good place to leave it, Christine. Thank you so much. Hey, if listeners wanted to hear from you a bit more, where would be a good place to follow along on your posts? And if you don't mind, share a little bit about what's up next for you. You have wrapped up a wonderful tenure at Handshake as the Chief Education Strategy Officer. You
Thank you.
told me, I think, what's coming up next, but tell listeners how they can find you and what maybe to expect from you in the coming months.
Sure, fantastic. Well, if you're looking for me, you can find me on LinkedIn. So feel free to look or connect with me there. And what's next is I don't know. I'm not sure yet. I haven't decided exactly what I'll be going into. I'm going to take the summer off. I'm doing some travel with family, and then I will figure out what's next in the fall. So feel free to
The
connect.
real reason I wanted to ask you that is I just wanted to make people feel jealous because that is such a cool moment when you have finished up a role and you don't have the absolute requirement to sort of jump into a new one right away. You can take a summer and hang out with family, and I would really like to have a nice gap at some point in my career
Oh,
for a few months.
thank
So
you.
congratulations on your success at Handshake and all that you do for our field and education. Hopefully, some amazing university snatches you up and figures out how to get you back on a campus. But
Thank you.
I look forward to reconnecting with you in due course. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, Christine.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Ryan.